Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Linn Tabak. I will moderate our discussion today. We're going to talk about drug pricing, finding the balance. We want to look at the cost of medicines, what determines the cost, what kinds of public policies might increase innovation in this field, and accessibility to needed medicines. To help us in this discussion, we have three guests today. I'll start at the far end here. Jonathan Lopez is a student at Cornell College and an LPN with some experience in Connecticut and now working in Iowa. I'll come back to you in a few minutes here and ask you to say more about that. And Dr. Tom Richmann is a physician here at Marion Family Practice here in Iowa and is an Iowan to begin with.
Correct.
Right? And Professor Ali Salem is a professor at the University of Iowa and an expert on pharmacy and pharmaceutical drugs and with a research lab down there too. So why don't we begin with you with a little elaboration there. Tell us something about your work at the university and your involvement with this field.
So I have two roles within the university. One is as I'm the Lyle and Sharon Bigley Chair of Pharmaceutical Sciences in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Iowa. And a responsibility in that position is both teaching pharmacists, but also teaching graduate students and doing research in drug development and pharmaceutical formulation. And so I bring to this discussion expertise in the drug development process that I believe will be informative. I also serve as the program leader for the experimental therapeutics program in the Holden Comprehensive Cancer Center in the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics, and that's a role that is very important for the state's only comprehensive cancer center, and both the patients that it serves, but also the research that it does in developing new therapies.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Richmann, tell me something about your medical career. And
I'm a family physician in Marion, work for Unity Point, and it's pretty straightforward after that.
Okay. And Jonathan is, I teach at Cornell College. I teach computer science. And I have met Jonathan for the first time just in the last few days. He expressed some interest in just coming to view the show, and then I learned he had this background that might be pertinent to our conversation. So tell us a little bit about your work.
Here I am. So I'm an LPN, and I've had experience with working in doctor's offices as an allergy specialist, and then from there I went on to home care. I've worked in hospice, and I'm currently working as a nurse at Manor Care, and there it's a rehab/nursing home, so it's long-term skilled nursing.
Okay. So I would like to get a sense for our audience of the dimensions or the scope of this problem. So we're talking about drug prices because the prices can be very high. And so I'd like to know who is most affected. So are there particular ailments, stages of life? Who is likely to be in a position where the price of drugs becomes a big issue? Anyone want to take the lead?
Sure, I can, on a daily basis, 30 to 50 patients a day that I have contact with in one form or another. Virtually affects everyone of every age. Probably the more geriatric patients on Medicare and on Medicaid state assistance programs. Very limited by what we can and cannot do, largely based on formularies and drug prices. And for the rapidly changing value of the drugs is also very frustrating to a lot of patients.
By value, are you talking about effectiveness or price here?
Price.
Price, yeah.
Yeah, so the economic value, not necessarily the therapeutic value.
All right, now you worked in hospices, You probably see people with lots of medicines, and tell us a little what the picture looks like if you're in a hospice or similar facility.
I mean, sometimes I've had patients who have 30 medications at one sitting, so that's quite a bit. The biggest one that I've noticed is patients who have diabetes. They can't afford to buy the insulin, so oftentimes they will ration it. Or lancets are really expensive. Glucometers can be expensive as well, so they oftentimes will do one glucose check a day instead of doing multiple times to keep track of their sugars throughout the day. So that obviously poses a risk, because if they don't know what's going on, they don't know if they're eating too much or not enough. So they're going to have to rely on the symptoms, and that's not, if you're not 100% sure on what the symptoms are, now you're putting yourself at risk. So that's one of that I would say is the biggest thing that I noticed with long-term care patients. Yeah.
Okay. Professor Salem, Jonathan just mentioned insulin. And in my preparation for the show, I read that insulin was developed or discovered almost 100 years ago, and yet the medicine is still expensive. Can you explain that?
There are different types of insulin
Okay.
that are available, and the cost of those types of insulin differ depending on the properties of the formulation.
Okay.
And so there are some formulations of insulin that you can purchase from Walmart, for example, that is substantially lower in price to a different type of insulin that is formulated in a different way. And so the reason for the changes in the prices is dependent on the manufacturing processes, the innovations that have been introduced into the manufacturing processes, and the way that they perform. And so those are all factors that can contribute to the different prices of the different types of insulins that are available. There was an inhalable insulin that was available on the market for a reasonable period of time, and it was very attractive for patients because they could potentially take it without having to take needles.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the reasons that it was pulled off the market was because the cost of production and the cost of manufacturing outweighed the amount of money that could be made from it when provided to the patients in terms of the cost to benefit ratio. And so that is something that the companies are constantly having to think about in whether a product is available or not.
How much decision making or negotiation when you're treating a patient? You have a lot of choices about the particular medicine. Are you and your patients often choosing between several different courses of treatment and looking at cost and effectiveness?
Absolutely, particularly with diabetes and now COPD. Cost of inhalers is ridiculous, and a lot of these medicines have been around for a long time. The delivery methods have changed a little bit, so the mechanism, but largely we're not talking large dollars to manufacture, but diabetes particularly is problematic, and it's not just insulin. There are now other medications that are used to reduce glucose by changing the way the kidneys function and eliminate, and those are incredibly expensive. And the marketing by the manufacturers is also a little bit swanky. If you have, yeah, it's a technical term.
Swanky is how I dress, Dr. Richmann.
So, but if you have private insurance, they'll give you a coupon and you can get their $400 a month drug for $25. If you're on Medicare or public insurance, that coupon doesn't work. And unfortunately, those medications aren't covered by a lot of the formularies.
What does this word formulary mean?
Formulary refers to the drug list that a particular insurance company puts together and says, we will pay for these drugs at this rate, or they'll be at another higher rate. And sometimes they won't even be on the formulary at all. And then we are doing paperwork to try and get the insurance company or the pharmacy benefit manager to authorize us to use that drug for a particular patient.
Now, I've read that sometimes it's the poorest who are paying the highest prices. You were in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Yes.
Bridgeport, Connecticut has some low-income areas.
It does.
Was that the circumstance in which you were working?
Not quite, but because I was working in Milford,
Okay.
But we did service a lot of Bridgeport residents there as well.
Okay.
And you're right. It's a lot of them are low income, and so oftentimes they would just tell me that they weren't going to get the EpiPens for the allergy specialty. You know, before we used to have EpiPen vouchers where you can get a free EpiPen. Once that was no longer available, that was around 2014, 2015, I believe it was. Mylan started giving out the vouchers for free EpiPens. A lot of them just flat out refused. They couldn't afford it. You know, it's not that they didn't want to get it, they just couldn't afford to get the EpiPen.
Did you tell me before our show when we had our conversation, did you use the phrase Benadryl bomb? Was that a phrase you used?
No, not Benadryl bomb, but I did say that because I was very concerned, of course, you know, as a allergy specialist, and I'm giving people treatments to take home. I'm not directly involved with their care at that point. They have to be able to, if they have any anaphylactic shock, to go ahead and treat themselves. If they don't have the EpiPen at home, I said, okay, well, we need to figure something out. So I ended up requesting that a company eat up the cost, and they actually ended up buying Benadryl. So I would actually stock Benadryl, and I would give them Benadryl. And I said, you know what, if anything happens, do not worry about how much, just chug away, because you need to be able to breathe. If not, you will not get anywhere. So that was actually the thing we had to do. That was a temporary solution, but it really wasn't, because there's no actual alternative for, Benadryl is not an alternative for epinephrine.
All right, so let's get some more vocabulary here. Another term that comes into play here is off-label use. So why don't one of the two of you help us understand that?
Off-label use is the using the medication for a purpose for which it was either not designed or has potentially a positive or negative side effect that you're trying to manipulate. As a good example, there are multiple different SSRIs or antidepressants. Some of them are marketed for, say, depression and anxiety, but some of them will also have an indication that was added later for, say, postmenopausal hot flashes. And if one does it, it's likely that the other ones will also have some effect that way. And sometimes you can manipulate that for, say, we want to get a little bit more pep, or we want to calm people down a little bit. We can choose one class or one medication or another based also not only on the effect, but also the side effect.
Okay, Professor Salem, I want to lean on you for your expertise here in telling us something about how drugs are developed, how medicines are developed. So there's a huge cost for the development of a single drug. Maybe you have some statistics there.
So there's a figure that's often used to say that it costs $1 billion to take a drug from identification all the way through to a product that's available to patients. And to give you an example of the various steps that need to go, that the candidate needs to go through before it can be developed, you can have 10,000 compounds, and you do screening and activity testing on all of those 10,000 compounds, and you'll only have maybe one of those that then moves forward and shows activity. You then have to do a lot of formulation work on the compound, you have to do stability testing, you have to do activity testing, and all of this will be in vitro, which is to have a monolayer of cells where you look at the activity and you see the mechanism of action. Then you would move forward to animal studies, and you will do the testing in small animals, and you'll do the testing in large animals. And the types of things that you're looking for are therapeutic activity for the disease of interest, and then you're also interested in toxicity. Is the drug candidate safe? What is the dose-dependent safety and toxicity that you see from that? Once you've identified something that has safety and efficacy in animal models, then you will test in a phase 1 clinical trial with patients where you look at primarily, the primary measure in a phase 1 test is safety. Is this a safe candidate in patients as it's been seen in animals? And then once you pass phase 1, then you move into phase 2, which is a larger trial where you're looking at activity, so efficacy. And if you pass the efficacy trials in a clinical trial with patients, then you would move into a phase 3 trial which is a multi-center trial with many institutions and many units testing the drug in a much, much larger scale to see if it has activity. At any stage during that drug development process, the candidate can fail. So for an example, if it doesn't show safety in the phase 1 trial, it can fail. If it doesn't show safety in the animal studies, it won't even get to the phase 1 trial. At the phase 2 trial, even after you've done safety and shown safety, if it doesn't have efficacy, it can fail at that point. And throughout this entire process, you winnow down and get to a much, much smaller number of candidates that make it all the way through the whole process, but you can see why there's such a significant cost associated with the development of the drugs, because there's so many steps involved and the cost of doing trials is so significant that in order to be able to get a drug approved, there is a tremendous cost associated with it. The FDA is involved in this whole process. So before you can do a phase 1 trial testing a drug, the stability data that you have of the drug and its formulations, the toxicity testing that you've done in animals, all of those things need to be submitted to the FDA where they evaluate it to determine whether you can be approved to move forward with a phase 1 trial. And again, every one of these steps requires costs. There's a lot of attrition throughout every step to get to the point where you approve a drug. And it's an expensive process to finally get a candidate that can move into the market.
Okay, so I don't know what our collective expertise is here.
Yeah.
But one of the arguments I've encountered finds fault with this testing process. There's some who even go so far as to say safety should be our concern and let the market determine efficacy. There are others who say that we're putting too much testing when we have a small change in the medicine, and this is stopping the or slowing the introduction of generic medicines when a patent expires, and we ought to get lower prices with greater competition. Do you have anything to say about those issues?
I'm not sure I would go along with the idea of market driving efficacy.
Okay.
I think there's a large potential gap for that, and there's potentially a lot of harm that could come from that as well.
Okay.
There's
There's
a lot of...
If you're very, very sick, shouldn't you be permitted to take some chances?
Yeah, but that doesn't apply to the vast majority of patients.
Okay.
There's a small handful where that may be beneficial, and I think the FDA has loosened up on some of those for some of those types of drugs. But for the large majority, the market may help determine price a little bit, maybe availability, but efficacy really has to be solid. 20 years ago, there were a lot of cough and cold preparations which were on the market. The market did very well. Prices were very cheap. Some went up a little bit. But the bottom line is that when the data was actually looked at, a lot of cough and cold medications don't have any effect on the disease that they're being marketed for treating. And so subsequently, they've been withdrawn from the market. Okay. So you've got to look at the science as well.
Okay, let's get some insurance terms or finance terms here on the table here. So I've already heard the initials PBM. Somebody's going to tell me what a PBM is.
It's so a PBM is a pharmacy benefit manager.
Okay.
And one thing I want to clear up is that is very different from a pharmacist, which is what we train in our college. And the reason I bring that up is because pharmacists are wonderful. They serve most of the counties in this state, and they provide free counseling to the patients. They're a really, really wonderful group of people that provide an incredibly important service to patients, both in terms of being the last line of defense and making sure that they have accurate dosing, but also providing counseling to them about what potential drugs could interact and why they shouldn't have them. Now, jumping back to the question though, which is pharmacy benefit managers, which is a different term, they are, I would describe them as middlemen that interact or negotiate prices between the insurers and the hospital providers and the manufacturers of the drugs to determine and to facilitate what pricing should be. They're one factor in the determination of pricing. And the way that works is that they will negotiate with industry a discount on the list price, so that the price that the insurers are having to pay or the hospitals are having to pay is significantly lower than the list price.
Okay.
And there are some issues associated with that, but the intent when PBMs first came about was to be something that helped patients by lowering the overall price, by having negotiations, by doing bulk negotiations, for an example. There was originally the intent, I think, when they first came about as a concept, was that this would be beneficial to the broader community and the broader society. What people have been seeing, and you see a number of reports on this in the news media, is that in selected cases, so it's not all PBMs are good, and not all PBMs are bad, but there are cases where when a PBM has been negotiating a discount, and I'll just throw out easy numbers for myself, but let's say that a list price of a drug is $100, and the PBM negotiates a 50% discount with the drug company so that it's $50, then that would be the price that they are purchasing the drug at. And in principle, that's a wonderful thing for the patient, but what's happened is, in selected cases, so it's not all patients, but in selected cases, patients, when they are paying their out-of-cost costs, or the out-of-pocket costs associated with it, or the co-payments, for an example, in a number of cases, they are not paying, so I'm going to throw out a number, let's say they have to pay 20% of a co-payment. If it was 20% of the $50, that would be $10. But what happens in a number of cases is that they are paying 20% off the list price, which is $20. So the benefit is not being transferred to the patient. And for those that don't have insurance, there's similar cases where they're having to pay the list price versus the negotiated price. And companies, as they have been negotiating with the PBMs, have in some cases raised their price, the list price, to help offset the discount that has been negotiated with the PBM, which is then raising the overall price. And that adversely affects those patients that are having to pay a co-payment for the list price, and also those patients that have to pay the list price because they don't have insurance. And it's had a negative impact in that respect. So pharmacy benefit managers, in the context that I'm talking about, can be good. They can be beneficial in negotiating lower prices, but there have been a number of examples where, and this is broad, that they have pushed prices up to the detriment of patients, and the benefits of their negotiations have not been transferred to the selected patients as well. Now, I will say that while PBMs are the bad guys in the media, they're right now they're being criticized across a wide range of platforms. One of the things that's worth noting is that they are not the sole component that is responsible for pricing. So there's a number of factors. There's government regulation, which I'm sure you're going to get to. There's the cost of the pricing that the industry is setting. There's the pharmacy benefit managers and how they're doing their negotiations, and then there's a series of other things as well. So it's a multifaceted, complicated topic. It's not down to just one single individual.
Okay. So I'm gonna turn to Jonathan here. In my reading on, so you can answer or not answer as you wish. But you're a young person. I'm gonna make you stand in for your whole generation here. So in my reading, on the political issue, the legal issue, the regulation and subsidy issue, I don't see a clear division between Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives. The surveys I see say lots of Americans preferring more regulation and more direct control of prices, even among people who otherwise espouse a free market philosophy. When you look at this issue as a young voter, do you have a sympathy with one way or another? All of the candidates are talking about this. Our Republican Senator Charles Grassley just had an op-ed piece on this. Our representative in the House of Representatives, Abby Finkenauer, is talking about this. Do you have a slant, a perspective?
I mean, I have a perspective as a nurse. I've seen many patients have to go without because the prices keep going up. You have to wonder and ask yourself, when is enough enough? Why do the prices keep going up? Can there be a cap, maybe for income brackets? So I'm not no specialist in this stuff, definitely.
Right.
So I know that my generation for sure is leaning towards that. They definitely want caps for medication prices, and so Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren come into play with that kind of situation and this conversation, because they're definitely the ones that are advocating for that the most.
I'm driving him home so I can straighten him out on the way back. Let's talk a little bit about this. There is much sympathy in the United States for a European or Canadian model, but I read criticisms that say that people in the last stages of life the survival rates for cancer are not as good. Medicines don't get to market as quickly in Europe, and in the end, the prices aren't that much different. Any perspective there? You have
I could harken back 20 years. There was a drug anticoagulant that was put on the market in Europe first.
Yep.
Fortunately, it never made it over here because it ended up causing a lot of liver damage. And so, I think we have a good layer of regulation as far as safety is concerned. Pricing, though, which is the subject of tonight's talk, or today's talk, is really multifaceted. And we can even start with the manufacturer's direct-to-consumer advertising.
That's right. That's an important topic.
Does it really influence anything that I do? Very little, other than I spend a little bit of education with the patient saying, well, this is really not what you need, and it's very expensive. So doing something to limit that cost may be a little bit of a more appropriate step.
Okay, we're down to the last 2 or 3 minutes here. I'm going to make one last point myself, and then I'm going to give each of you like 10 seconds to say something here. I read about calls for Medicare to negotiate with drug companies, and I think, how can that happen? If I'm selling my car, I know what negotiation means because both parties are free to walk away. You can find lots of other people who will sell you a Camry, and I can find lots of other people who want to buy a Camry. But in the case of Medicare, Medicare's a monopoly. Where is the negotiation there? Does anybody buy into that negotiation? And then say a last word of what you want our listeners to take home today.
There is no negotiation.
Okay.
And there should be.
Same boat.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah. If I used England as an example, there's a National Institute for Care and Health Excellence that negotiates with drug companies the pricing, and they look at the benefits of the drug versus the cost, and they get very good prices at a national rate for the patients in the United Kingdom. And in this country, the government doesn't negotiate the rules in the same, or the pricing in the same way, and I think they could do more.
Okay. So thank you all for this conversation today, Jonathan and Dr. Richmann and Professor Salem. And thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News. We hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.